Good morning, everybody. My name is Stefan Schweinfest. I'm the director of the UN Statistics Division, and this has become a beautiful tradition early in New York morning and different times, of course, around the globe for a community of people to connect under the heading of the United Nations Network of Economic Statisticians to discuss issues beyond GDP. This is now the sixth Beyond GDP meeting in 2023, the sprint, as we like to call them. And even I think by our own standards, we would be a bit justified to be breathless because this was the third sprint within 2 weeks, if I understand that correctly. So we are really in the middle of something. I can add my own breathlessness to it because we are right in the middle of what we here in New York call UNGA, the United Nations General Assembly. You may have seen pictures all around the world. There was an SDG summit as part of this General Assembly session this week opening, and data played a prominent role, and especially capturing all dimensions of the sustainable development, requesting to capture better individual and distributional measures, requesting to better capture the integration of information. So what I'm trying to say here is you are spot on with your discussions because I mean, really at the highest political level, there is the demand for developing measures in this direction. We are in something like what I like to take stock taking exercise, looking around the world. What is there in terms of different measures in different countries already? What work has been done on distribution? That was the topic last week. The week before, we were talking about the dashboards. And we had 165 participants, so there seems to be like a very dedicated core group of people looking at these issues. And I in particularly liked last week when we talked about distributional frameworks that Tim declared that the United Nations Day beyond averages. So we are making important contributions, and I am very happy that we have participants that represent a wide spectrum: national statistical offices, academia, international and regional organizations, and it's a little bit the same today. So what's the topic of today? Composite single measures. So we have talked about dashboards 2 weeks ago, and dashboards, of course, capture a broader spectrum of topics, may give you detailed insights on various aspects of well-being, including income and wealth, covering work, job quality, housing, health, environment, and other topics. So giving you a set of a deck of cards, so to speak, to look at the various dimensions of development and potentially look at the impact or the various impacts of policy interventions. Now, another way of doing that, or an additional way, I may say, doing it, is composite indices. That is a combination of multiple indicators that are projected into a single index to represent the overall development movement, so to speak. Now, we all know the advantages and disadvantages, and after looking at various presentations, this group will be in a particularly good position to discuss those in even greater detail. Indices, composite indices are simpler to interpret. They attract usually more attention and easy to communicate. But of course, they also sometimes run the risk of oversimplifying very complicated um, developments, literally. So today we will have a look at a number of efforts of new research in this area, looking at what is done at national statistical offices or national level in general, at the central banks, at our own regional commissions. And so we will gain some of their see some of their insights and methodological work and successes and challenges. So this is very good, and it is really in the spirit of what I called earlier our stock taking exercise, because whatever we want to do at the global level in the future should solidly build on everything we already have. So, and I also want to stay away from a religious debate of dashboards versus composite indices. That is, and maybe the two are not that are also not entirely irreconcilable. There could be a dashboard of composite indicators, and so, and a dashboard can be translated in additional information into a composite index. So I think the best way to do is to take stock, and we are just doing that. And I thank Richard here, who is in my upper left-hand corner here on my screen. So that is appropriate because he is sort of the intellectual lead of this exercise. Thanking him and his UK ONS colleagues for all the preparatory work. And for every event like this, we need preparatory work, and he has company with the Canadian colleagues, colleagues from Maldives, Indonesia, Netherlands, and the US, who constitute our core group and our bureau of the network of economic statisticians. So I thank all of them. I thank all of you for connecting. The numbers are still rising here for us early in the morning here in New York. I'm looking forward to the presentations and learning something. And the way we will do this now is that I first turn over to Tim from our own UN Population Division, who was one of the leading forces of last sprint on distributional measures, to give us a quick recap on the fifth meeting. And then Richard Hayes from the UK ONS will take the lead in chairing the rest of the morning. So thank you again. I hope I whet your appetite, and let's have a good meeting. Tim, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. I'm going to start doing the necessary clicks.
Just while Tim is getting the IT to work, we found that with large audiences, if you can keep your microphone on mute, if you are not presenting or asking a question, that does help the flow of the event. Back to you, Tim.
Okay, you should be able to see my slides now.
We are.
Beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick 5-minute recap of Beyond Averages Day. And key message, well, we had the Fab Four with us last week, the 4 frameworks that look beyond averages. What characterizes these 4 frameworks? Well, they're well-developed methodologies. They're producing data sets on inequality, and they're being used by researchers, national governments, media, and the general public. Who are the Fab Four? They are national transfer accounts. Second is household distributional accounts. That's based off of the expert group on distributional national accounts, e.g. DNA. Distributional national accounts, also known as the World Inequality Database. And finally, the Spatially Disaggregated Human Development Index. Now, some next steps, key takeaways from the Beyond Averages Day. First, it may not be possible to unify the 4 frameworks. So Stefan was just using the analogy of a deck of cards. I'd use the analogy here for these 4 frameworks, toolbox. So, we have hammers, we have wrenches, we have saws. So we have different policy uses for these 4 frameworks. And of course, they're slightly different approaches. But what we can do is develop a consolidated guide to these frameworks. And so that would serve 2 purposes. The first is to facilitate a better assessment of the policy implications of each of the frameworks. And secondly, the sharing of innovative approaches across the frameworks, because very often they're using, for example, the same data and confronting the same sort of challenges with that data. So finally, the UN network can facilitate working arrangements and collaborations between these communities to draft the guidance notes. A couple of headlines. Well, I just was talking about the frameworks being the Fab Four, but it could also have been our presenters as the Fab Four. They were all great. We had Alexia talking about national transfer accounts, and I guess I can't go through all the headlines, but what I'd highlight from each speaker for Alexia, if you're looking at demographic change and you want to understand how demographic change is affecting the economy, public redistributions, then that's a use of NTA. Urit was talking about household distribution accounts, and just like the name sounds, if you want to understand what's happening to households, how they're affected by specific events like COVID, assessing household vulnerability, or the impact of select policies on specific household groups, then you want to be using these household distribution accounts, which also produce simultaneously, they're measuring these 3 dimensions simultaneously: income, consumption, and wealth. Lucas was talking about distributional national accounts, also known as the World Inequality Database, that provides income and wealth distributions for more than 140 countries since the 1980s and 1990s.
Tim, can I just check, are your slides meant to be moving forward, and can other people see the slides have changed?
They should be moving forward. On my computer, they are.
Okay.
They are. I think he's now talking about Lucas, and Lucas' name is on the screen.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm just all coffeeed up, so I'm speaking a million miles an hour. So we're on the Lucas slide already. But that's good, because we're going to come in at 5 minutes. Perfect. So Lucas is talking about distributional national accounts. And so this is just a wonderful data source. The cool thing about this is they're using all available data. So they've got tax data, household surveys, national accounts, rich lists, etc. Finally, Yan Chun is speaking about the Human Development Index, of course, a widely used alternative metric in global development. And she was talking particularly about the disaggregated Human Development Index. And so she gave 2 wonderful examples. We'll have the links later in the presentation. The Human Climate Horizons platform, looking at climate change at the hyper-local level, and also the HDI, the Human Development Index, also at the hyper-local level. So if you haven't checked out those 2 platforms, it's really worth your time. Finally, we had 2 discussants, our dynamic duo. We had Piedad Ordinola, Director General of DANE, speaking to us about the synergies across these 4 approaches. Now, in particular, she highlighted 2 additional dimensions to pay attention to in inequality: gender and climate change. And she also pointed out that what we really need now, we have these well-developed methods, we have data already available, we need investment in technical capacity of the NSOs. And then finally, Eduardo Rios Neto, professor at Federal University of Minas Gerais, but formerly head of the Statistical Office of Brazil. He, again, comparing the synergies across the approaches. 2 of the accounting measures focus on distributions, and the other, NTA, focuses on more stratification by population group. He also noted differences in the level of approach, with one framework focused on households, another focused on adults, and the third focused on individuals. And finally, I'll stop here by saying the final slide of my presentation shows links to the various manuals and guidelines across the 4 frameworks, and access to the data provided by those frameworks. So I'll stop sharing there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. I think there may have been some technical challenges for 1 or 2 attendees. The slides are posted on the webpage for the sprint. They're the second set down, just before Tim's name. So if you do want to go back and have a good look at them, please do. They're very, very good slides. Right. So I am now going to share. Stefan, if you can shout when you can see the screen, that would be perfect.
We can see it now. It's in presentation mode. Perfect.
Looks fine, Richard. Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm going to spend 50 minutes or so just helping to queue up the conversation, and some of the things I'm going to say are very, very similar to what Stefan has just said. So I think there's a lot of common views here, but there's also quite a lot of variation in the way people think about and consider these issues. I will start with the normal disclaimer. These are my thoughts and views, not necessarily those of the ONS, although I don't think I'm going to say anything particularly contentious. But I will start by saying when I joined the Office for National Statistics, one of the big questions that I was sort of pitched was, are you an economic statistician? Are you a social statistician? And I had to sort of say, I'm not particularly sure I know. What's the difference? And I was helpfully told that economic statisticians generally assume that everything can be converted into money terms, and social statisticians generally don't. And I think that's probably a good starting off point for a discussion about beyond GDP and how we think about composite indices. Because one of the things we're attempting to do through this agenda is bring together a very varied community of data producers and data users. And so we do need to be thinking very carefully about how we present data, how we share data in ways that don't immediately hit cultural barriers in the way that we think about these things. And building that stronger community, I think, needs us to drill down to some of these issues. So it's a real pleasure to be able to bring you this session today, which hopefully I believe is probably a little bit more open-ended in terms of the discussion that we're going to have today than some of the previous presentations and sprint sessions we have, and very much do feel free to intervene with your questions and comments for the speakers as we go through. Please raise questions in the chat bar as we progress. So a little bit of my agenda here, but I'm going to keep going straight on through to just defining some terms to make sure that we're all confident that we're on the same and common ground. So composite indices are produced through bringing together varied types of data series through a weighting process which produces a single set of data, normally shown as an index through time. And this is, represented by, we see all sorts of these. We're going to see several of these today, but of course GDP is the classic composite indicator. If we think about y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m, which those of us who are economic statisticians can probably rehearse in our sleep, that is exactly the way that we would think about that metric. In opposition to that, or at the other end of the spectrum, I've given you an example there of a classic dashboard, which is the UK National Wellbeing Dashboard that was presented by Eleanor a couple of weeks ago in these sessions, which rely on allowing each individual data series to speak for itself, which give each data series the space and the opportunity to relay its core message and its core characteristics without being mediated through this process of aggregation. And essentially, how we bring these two together and how we think about these is at the core of the discussion I hope we're going to have today. And that debate really boils down to a couple of key areas. Now, I'm going to flag that there are two international guidance documents which I think are especially core in this territory. There's the OECD Handbook on Constructing Composite Indices, and from 2019, the UNECE published guidelines on producing leading composite and sentiment indicators. And much of what I've taken in this I'm going to present today comes from those sources, and the link to the OECD document, which is a little bit older, I've put onto the page. I will also circulate the UNECE reference. But you see here, I think, the core of the conversation. It's easier for the general public to interpret composite indicators than to do the work of drilling through a wider data set to identify common trends. but composite indicators can sell misleading policy messages if they're poorly constructed or misinterpreted, which is really reinforced by Rosen's work in 1991 about composites are only as good as they are fit for the intended purpose. But of course, these things, statistics is a competitive world. And so I've taken here an older quote from Mahbub al-Haq when he was asking Amartya Sen to help develop the Human Development Index many years ago, recognizing that I want you to help me to build an index which is just as vulgar as GDP, so not a very high bar to be set, except that it will stand for better things in the sense that its merit would be that it's in fitness of its intent for its intended purpose, not necessarily vast degrees of sophistication. So at the core of this debate is the ambiguous sort of grey territory where both of these approaches have benefits and disadvantages. And I'm not going to run through these in detail, except to say this is a very balanced and nuanced debate where I think in many ways it is not the fact that there are two distinct methodologies that we should probably be tying ourselves up about. It's about thinking about what a good dashboard or a strong dashboard, what a strong composite indicator looks like, such that we're actually ensuring that we're comparing like with like and best in class with best in class. I think it's fairly easy for us all to identify examples of weak dashboards or weak composite indicators that we may have seen in the past, which don't serve that function of being fit for purpose or don't hit clearly the mission statement on the nail on the head. But I want this conversation, if possible, to be focused on the best in class and how we think about the best in class for both of these and how we compare their strengths and weaknesses. I'm going to keep going because at its simplest, I think this quote from Sharp, which is nearly 20 years old, I think still pretty much sums up the two camps quite well. Aggregation can work if you believe it captures reality and is meaningful, and has the attractive quality that it easily gathers media attention and the attention of policymakers, simply because that simplicity, it goes up, it goes down, it stays the same, is very easy to communicate to a wider or a lay audience. Whereas non-aggregators do worry when they see an arbitrary weighting process which imposes a false equivalence between different indicators which potentially need to be thought about in slightly different ways. Just to augment this, I think the point about there being real worries, and I think even I come from the economic statistics camp, but even I recognize that there are some things that you just cannot easily convert into money, and I'm going to touch on that a bit more. Whereas we can also see the worries about dashboards leaving important data drowned in. Sometimes it is difficult to see the wood from the trees, particularly as dashboards grow to exceedingly large scales, which we have seen instances of in the past. So I'm going to focus now on what makes a good composite indicator. As I say, I'm going to lean into the pre-existing work, and I think for me there are four key aspects which, as we look at some of the work we're going to see today, we should bear in mind, because I believe that all the talks that we have presenting today clearly sort of hit these objectives. Which is one of the reasons we've invited them, but very much a clear theoretical framework. I think particularly in Beyond GDP, which as a topic necessarily draws data from a wide variety of different statistical domains, making sure that we're not in a position where we have assembled some data on education, some data on education, and some data on education, and then called it a comprehensive measure. Being able to show that we are coherently capturing the full spread of those domains, topics, issues that are relevant, I think is key to our work. Obviously, we need to rely on analytically sound and robust input series. As statisticians, we all know the worry of input in, rubbish in equals rubbish out, and that is something that we want to avoid in all possible circumstances. The next two, I think, though, are probably the ones which are more at the centre of the debate. The first two are very much the motherhood and apple pie approach to statistics. Transparent methods to impute missing data, I think, is really important to make sure that as we look at indices through time, that they hold that validity, that there is a meaningful way for us to link everything together. But the one which causes, I think, the most debate, and Stefan referenced that he didn't want this to become a religious debate. I think this is the one where we're closest to the possibility of theological war, is about objective weights and agreeing how you aggregate using objective weights. What does objectivity mean, and how should we be conceptualizing that? And for me, essentially, weights are essentially value judgments. They're our method by which we try to tackle the concept of how we value the different elements of our composite or our dashboard. And I think actually, you know, when we stand back, my instinct, as I've looked at the work that has been produced over the last couple of years, this is our second series of sprints. Last year, we looked at what was in play. This year, we've looked a little bit more at how it's been developed and what it does. This is essentially a common problem. This is not a composite indices question or a dashboards question. Both suffer from this question of how we reveal trade-offs, how we share that information with users, and how we make sure we are able to produce an output which is impactful in policy terms. Now, this question of objectivity, for me, I've put some words in bold in the center here about a mechanism to expose the relative value a whole society as a collective place on different outcomes or outputs in an unbiased fashion, I think is at the heart of how we achieve this, and different perspectives on how we can capture that collective view, that impartial view, which doesn't rely on the a priori opinions of those who are assembling the index, is something that we need to think about very carefully, because this is an area where I've no doubt there are very strongly held views, but it's worth us thinking about what the option set looks like, because we can then begin to consider the relevance and the strengths of these. I think equally important, I think we need to be very careful to think about the principle of if you can't find a weighting metric, can we weight everything with a unit of one? Sort of Laplace principle of if you can't find a weighting method, is it better to give everything equal weights rather than subjectively imposing a framework? I think the important thing for us to consider is how close we think that is as an approximation of the truth. Is it better to be approximately right or absolutely wrong? I think is a principle, again, that we will have heard over the years and which is probably worth thinking about. So just to speed up, some of the options that we have, and we're going to see some of these discussed today in the various presentation. If one accepts that market prices are independently set by the population, then they are a reflection of relative value that reflects the collective wisdom, or at least the preferences of society. This is, this takes us straight back to that point about transparent mechanisms to impute prices for non-market items. If we do not have strong mechanisms to generate market equivalent imputations of price, this immediately falls down. And where we are going beyond the market measures, this is a really key point. Beyond GDP inherently takes us beyond markets. Time, I'm not going to say much about this because Leonard, who's on screen, is going to talk to us a lot more about using time shortly. Richard Layard and Emmanuel Deneve have also talked about the potential of using well-being years, so taking a measure of subjective well-being, the average sort of subjective well-being achieved over a year, and thinking about how that is affected and driven by different policy outcomes, which gives you the potential to have a metric that actually we could use or consider for weighting, which is directly related to sort of the end goal of how society feels the well-being that they state and reveal about themselves. There are other ways that we can think about this. I've mentioned surveys, but I'm probably going to, for the benefit of pace, keep moving forward, where we do need to think about whether some of those mechanisms may or may not be relevant in different domains. I think there is an argument that prices might give you a very strong view of the market economy and those products which are nearest the economy. And Cleanna Taylor is going to talk later on about some of the work from the UK, which has taken that principle. But you'll notice in Herb Talk, we don't stray very far into some of the key social areas where I think even as economists, we recognise that prices are only capable of stretching so far. And so just to finish, I guess the final question is, even if we have sets of alternative weighting metrics, are they alternatives or are they complements? Are there ways of bringing these together? So I've given you sort of the relationships which are potentially there between three of these prices, time and well-bees. In the UK government, we have an estimate of a well-be year, the average well-being of the average person in the UK being somewhere in the region of about £13,000 a year, which allows us to get convertibility on that side. I would say thinking about how to relate well-bees and time is slightly more difficult. I had a notion of thinking about the ratio of leisure time to work time, but some of my colleagues helpfully pointed out I was clearly wrong there, because many people derive a lot of benefit, a lot of well-being from the work that they do and their work environment. So that's an area that I'm certain is going to need more work to consider as we move forward. But obviously average hourly wages give us a mechanism to relate time to prices, and whether we need one overriding metric or whether we're comfortable with having different metrics in different parts of the GDP landscape, as long as we have this understanding that there is an interoperability between them, I think is a debate that we can continue to have. So just really to kick us off and let us getting into today's sprint. Today, you've got a number of speakers who are going to talk to you about new developments in developing composite indices, new methods development, and particularly a focus in how composites are being used in practice in different parts of the world and in different arenas. I hope very much that you look forward and get a lot from the presentations today, and I will pause there, take my slides down, and I think we have a few minutes for any questions. No, we're straight on through to the next session, but don't worry, I'm sure you can pose me questions and I'm more than happy to come back in. But first, we're going to take us straight into the question of using time as a weight. So I'd like to introduce Leonard Nakamura from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, who produced this paper with Professor Diane Coyle from Cambridge. So Leonard, if you'd like to bring your slides up, I will pass directly to you.
Okay.
Thank you. They're in full screen mode. Perfect, Leonard.
Okay, great. So I'd like to thank you particularly, Richard, for inviting me to do this presentation, which has provoked a lot of new thoughts together with Diane Coyle and also Chuck Hulton. I'm going to be talking rather speculatively about using time to weight a well-being index, and just making some observations. This is very early research. The standard disclaimer applies. These are my opinions and not those of the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So the basic point is that time is all we have. And we experience well-being during time. So how we spend time, our activities, forms a matrix for well-being. There's we're trying to create a kind of an accounting framework for well-being here. Now, we're going to be leaning heavily on the idea of time use surveys to fill out this accounting framework. And in particular, we're thinking about time use surveys that also survey well-being during activities. Time is democratic and it's a constraint. We all have 24 hours in a day and we are all on an equal footing. And this democratic notion is useful particularly for well-being surveys, which are generally one person, one vote affairs. That is, we average across individuals regardless of whether they're rich or poor. Here are a couple of papers that I've written with Diane and with Chuck that show some of the ideas that underlie this presentation. So the way economists tend to look at the world is as if the main question we ask ourselves is, what shall I buy today? But what shall I do today is really the question that we tend to ask ourselves more. It's a homo economicus that asks the question of what shall I buy today? So this is a much more encompassing question. And but there's a link between the two, which is that what Adam Smith has said, that the real price of everything is the time it takes to acquire it. That is the toil and trouble of acquiring it, which is at the base of the labor theory of value. So I'm going to be using two facets of time. One is what I've just been talking about, that we experience well-being over periods of time, and therefore time allocations, hours, are weights. But also time is a constraint in our economic decisions alongside money. How long do we want to do our activities, such as playing or socializing or working? And economists do this applying a shadow value of time, or time to consume. In terms of time and well-being, well-being in the simplest view is, I'm going to use you as my index of well-being, that well-being is a sum of well-beings over time, summing the well-beings at different activities over time. And there's a built-in hypothesis there that well-being is additive over time. I'm not going to go into the issue of whether well-being is unidimensional or multidimensional. I'm going to be talking mainly as if it were unidimensional here, but that isn't necessary. Then the question that naturally arises is, can different ratings of well-being be summed up? So if well-being is more or less additive, that means that if we sample well-being in time use surveys that have well-being measures attached to activities, say rated 1 to 5, do ratings per hour average to ratings per day or week. So if you have a day in which your feelings are pretty blah, so you're around a 2 somewhere, it would be odd. This wouldn't work if you then go back and say, well, it was actually a 4-day overall. But we don't expect that to happen. But on the other hand, maybe recent well-being matters more to overall well-being than past well-being. So there are those issues. And we want to consider well-being at all our different activities, including work or investing in ourselves or relationships, travel. Now here I'm going to try to link up well-being with GDP, which is something that Chuck Hulton and I and Diane and I have been working on. And so money and time are, as Richard showed possibly in the slide, are somewhat interchangeable, that money can save us time or time can make us money. And in that way, we can think of a shadow value of time in terms of monetary units. We can think, say, of our wage as being $30, or we can think of the shadow value of money and time. That is, we can think of $1 as being worth a couple of minutes at that rate. And progress in well-being can be viewed either as being able to afford more goods monetarily or to have more free time in hours. Now, GDP ignores externalities and broad time use, focusing on transactions. And the well-being movement has done a brilliant job of highlighting changes in time and in externalities like climate, knowledge, and in inequality. Nevertheless, GDP remains a core concern of politics, finance, and business activity. So it'd be nice if we could see well-being in a way that was inclusive of GDP. And GDP is part of well-being. I mean, economists write well-being is equal to well-being as a function of consumption subject to a budget constraint of some kind. Here I've written down a wealth constraint where our consumption is limited by our wealth and our income. But we can add to that, as Gary Becker did, a time constraint as well, so that well-being is a function not just of our economic activities represented by CT, but also ZT, the time required for each of those activities. And that adds an additional constraint that our use of our time must add up to the total. So we can, among other things, use time use to expand GDP out more towards well-being within a money metric. Diane and Coyle and I have argued that rapid changes in time use we are experiencing are not reflected in GDP, and we point out ways that thinking about that can help us advance our understanding of what is or is not in GDP and what we mean by productivity. Got it. Chuck Hulton and I have argued more formally that information and other externalities like climate need to be included in expanded GDP, and we illustrate how that might be done. So the value of a money metric is that it, for adding in aspects of well-being, is that it is comparable to GDP. But because time is money, we could also perhaps go in the other direction. We could replace money with hours, and time can become the numeraire with GDP expressed in time. So from this perspective, let's say a shadow value of time is $30 because that's the average US wage. An activity's full cost is its direct monetary cost plus its time cost. So you go to a Taylor Swift concert, you have to pay for the ticket, that's $253, but the concert takes 3.5 hours time. So all in, that's roughly $360 in money or 12 hours in time. So we can measure full costs in hours or in dollars. Using time as a numeraire is excellent in the sense that it is more democratic. A poor person's hours are as valuable as a rich person's. though the rich one has much more money. Money metrics are plutocratic, while well-being measures are democratic. And in general, when we aggregate well-being scores across individuals, we aggregate them democratically with individuals. Now, it's also possible to do things like household income in a more democratic way, as Aitken and Wheels have shown in a ESCO working paper. So let's think about how we might use these ideas. Well, working from home implies a decline in total work time once we include commuting time. And there's been a massive shift in many countries to working from home. This may imply a lesser place for the economy in well-being. And that's reflected in a higher wage per total work hours, even though measured wages are unaffected. It's about 2%. Most hours, of course, are not spent at work. How we feel during work is an important element of well-being. So we also have to think about whether work well-being changes in remote work. Social connections were affected by the pandemic. Socializing takes time and transportation. We've gone a lot towards using more phone, email, text, and Zoom that takes less transportation time. But on the other hand, there appears to be a loneliness epidemic, as the US Surgeon General has said. Finally, climate change affects all our activities, and understanding how climate affects well-being is a crucial unmeasured aspect that how we feel during activities can help us address. Investments are not well incorporated in well-being analysis, and we don't, but investments are not that well incorporated into GDP either. So anyway, that's my talk. This is very much work in progress. We're just scratching the surface of these ideas. Please, if you don't get a chance to discuss your comments with me here, email me. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good talk. Thank you very, very much. We're going to move straight through to our second speaker, Khaled Abu Ismail from ESCWA, who's going to take us through the World Development Challenges report. And then we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So do please raise your questions in the sidebar, or feel free to put your hand up when we reach the questions.
Thank you, Richard.
Over to you.
Can you
That's
see my
perfect.
slides?
Yes.
All right. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And yeah, a lot of what I wanted to say on the conceptual side has been covered by you, Richard. So thanks also for that. I mean, especially on the conceptual parts. And in fact, usually I start this with going back to Robert Heilbronner and Milberg. They have a really nice book on. Both of them are well-known, established American economists. Bob Heilbronner passed away a few years ago, and they wrote a really nice book on the crisis of vision in economics. And their main point was that the pre-analytics, the stuff that you know about the world before you get into the number crunching, really plays a vital role in shaping the narrative of the numbers. And then I think this is a key insight in anyone who's about to go into questions like how do you measure well-being, what are the metrics, dashboard or not, and especially when you get into composite indices, this is where you're, as you mentioned, Richard, the issues related to weighting is very vital. So I'm going to talk about the World Development Challenges report, but I'm not going to talk about the results, because the objective here is really as a stock-taking exercise, as you mentioned, more than talking about the nitty-gritties of the result. And and it basically explaining what the ESCWA approach is, our journey in addressing these complex questions. So for us, going beyond GDP can be done in two ways. One is improving the measure itself, and you look at things like the quality of this income, the sustainability of it, the resilience of it, whether or not it takes into account environment, and of course, learners also talk about time use. And that's one trajectory, that's one pathway. And the other one, which I think we're more focused on today is, or at least my presentation will be more focused on, is going beyond in a more horizontal sense. I mean, really departing from the idea of capturing material money metric well-being. And that's what we mean by complementarity. So two things need to happen for this complementarity. You need to have something of value, but also you need to have something that adds to the narrative of GDP. That basically in statistical terms means to have a low correlation with income. So keeping this in mind, we've been working on some proposals. I'm not going to talk too much about the ones related to resilience. We're working on a resilience index, or even ideas like, does GDP pass through to households? And you compare between national accounts estimates and household income survey estimates. That stuff is a whole body of work that I'm not focused on. But I'm going to focus on the second set of issues, which is how can you add value to that GDP narrative by moving away from it, and how can you capture that? So there are two indices that we developed. One, which is the cornerstone of our World Development Challenges report, and that's the Development Challenges Index. And then a sort of a sequel to that is the Development Inequalities Index. And one is obviously moving beyond averages as well. But then the question that I think I want to end with is, how do we, as an institution, I'm here speaking about the authors of this report, not for the institution or let alone for the UN. So that's important to take into account. And how do we, building on that, then propose something that makes sense from this beyond GDP perspective? So basically, the report, the motivation, and I guess we get asked this question a lot, is why does a regional commission in the UN work at the global level? The answer is simple, because if you want to talk about human development, let's say, and this is our starting point, and the human development capability approach, Hubel Huck, Amartya Sen, all of the work that led to this fantastic human development index, and apply it to the region, our region, you get a very different narrative than the one you think exists out there, going back to the Bob Halboner analogy of the pre-analytics. So we understood that there's some limitations to the HDI. Now the question is, how can you improve it? Well, to do that, you need to go back to the global, set the stage, and then go back again to the region and then retell the story. And that's what we're doing in this World Development Challenges report. But in the process, we're also fulfilling another mandate of the regional commissions, which is to inform these kinds of debates that we're having today. So how do we do that? Well, the HDI is the starting point, but we adjust for three things. One is the quality of the human development achievements, quality of income, quality of health, quality of education, and that's the challenge. These are three challenges that affect rich countries, middle-income countries, poor countries. No one can dispute that. And then there's the sustainability challenge, and then there's the governance challenge. And you can find conceptual arguments for these challenges going all the way back to the early literature on human development, predating, the 90s even. But we also have a nice trick in bringing together these challenges in the indicator. We're going to do two things, and these are, the indicators. You can, of course, refer back to the report and the technical papers for a full explanation for each one of them. There was actually a background paper for each one of these indicators, justifying why, for example, you would have the TIMS as an adjustment, a discount factor for adjusting the quality of mean expected or years of education. But again, that's something I'll refer back to. So the point I want to make is that there are two, I would say, axiomatic principles here. One, and this is also coming from my work on the multidimensional poverty index, which I think a colleague of ours will talk about, and working with Sabina Al-Kir and that camp, is that you don't start with an index enforcing some kind of weighting scheme. The best weighting scheme is the nested one. And that's because no one can make a good case that health is more inherently valuable than education, or sustainability is more important than governance. What you can do, and this is important, is to imply a direction of causality between one dimension and another. And in this scheme, we argue, the authors of this work argue, that it's institutions that really matter more in terms of the direction of causality. But it doesn't mean that governance is more important and therefore it has to have more weight. So that's one of the first principles that I think is important in looking at. That is not something that the statistical database will help you in deciding on. But what we do is we do a lot of robustness tests. And this answers another one of the fundamental questions. In order to see whether this nested weight approach is plausible. And as it turned out, that it came out to be one of the best top 5% of possible solutions when you do your statistical sensitivity analysis and PCA exercises and so forth. So as this is a challenge index, we have the flip of the Human Development Index. The closest you are to 1, the higher the challenge. And the nice thing about this is that you look at the report, and number 1 in the world is going to be Chad or Sierra Leone, or the most challenged country, right? Because this is the race, the real race that we want to have is to help these countries meet their address these challenges, okay? But we have 5 categories of challenge. So there's one more than what the HDI does. But it's the same way of constructing an index that has been adopted by the Human Development Report Office. So we build on that methodology pretty much. I'm not going to go through the results, but you can see here that it's nice because we have another innovation is that we adopt the arithmetic weighting scheme and not the geometric one. And there are good reasons why you want to do that when you have many indicators, statisticians would know. But also because it allows you to decompose the index into contributions or shares by each one of these challenges. So you can see that the challenge, the governance challenge is the most important worldwide, and followed by, the human development quality challenge and so forth. And you can also go within the population distribution within each of these challenges. You can dig in even each one of these challenges into their components, and you can look at the distribution of each contributing factor. So that's basically what we did with the World Development Challenges report. Now, the interesting thing is that you can then go back, as I said, and focusing here on the Arab states, retell the story. You see how much the narrative changes compared to your GNI per capita, and even compared to, and even compared to the DCI. And the narrative changes tremendously. And that's the point here. That's the objective of this exercise. But it's also relevant not just for the Arab states, it's also relevant worldwide, and we highlight that in the report. But also, interestingly, not all Arab countries are net out losers if you adopt that. 3 or 4 Arab countries actually stand to gain. Now we go into another complementary index, which is basically the inequalities. These are looking at vertical and horizontal inequalities within countries, okay? So, and that's important. That's, you're looking at gender inequalities, but they're the same challenges, the same 3 challenges. And you can also decompose, and you can also come up with nice narratives about what is the highest contribution to the Development Inequalities Index. And there's also a paper arguing that. You can also tell which countries are at the highest level of inequalities versus which ones are at the lowest. You can look at the difference between your Gini, income Gini, and see how much of a difference it makes in terms of the overall narrative. Pretty much everything that we've done before. 2 correlations that matter, I think, in telling the story: the relationship between governance and human development. As I said here, directions of causality are important, but that's another intellectual debate. But the funnel-shaped diagram that you have, the scatter plot that you see here, is important. What that message, and this is a key message, after a certain level of governance, the relationship is linear. It's nice, it's tidy, it's neat. And the message here, the policy implication, is that there are many pathways to this relationship between governance and human development. But after a certain point of governance, it becomes more understandable. And I think the same thing can be said to the relationship between inequalities and human development challenges. So these insights, I think, are extremely important. Now, in the last 2 minutes, I want to talk about the key question. How can you build on all of this to design a good beyond GDP measure? Well, let's go back to the 2 criteria we have. Number 1, it has to have value. And we've established that the DII components and the DCI components are valuable, inherently valuable, things that matter to us. Number 2, they have to have low correlation with GDP. Well, that's exactly what we did here. And in this proposal, I mean, and this isn't a published paper, it's still work in progress. But it's important because it gives you this nice picture, which is that if you're going to establish those 2 criteria and correlate with GDP, you're going to actually get the lowest correlation with income, with the income index, compared to the HDI or the DCI or the DII. Now, the narrative that this produces can also be quite different if you apply it to countries. So basically, I want to say that, you know, there are statistical elements to this exercise and there are conceptual ones. But the key point is that it is so easy to build an index if you're clever enough. What is very difficult, and this is the lesson learned from working on MPIs and DCIs for the past, I don't know, 20 years or so, is that it is very difficult to build consensus. Okay, and just the Arab multidimensional poverty index, it took us maybe 6 months of technical work. It took us 6 years of building consensus, getting countries to adopt it as they did. And that's what we did with the DCI. It took a lot of effort, not in designing the index initially, but also in making sure that it was adopted by the experts and by the member countries. And we're taking it down at the national level in a few countries right now. Last slide, you can visit all this on our website, and there's even a simulator if you want to tinker around with the weights and see what happens. So thank you very much, Richard, again, for giving me the opportunity to talk about all of this. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much. And I see our first question has come into the sidebar. So Tim, did you want to come back in and kick us off? And then we'll take Ian's question and then we'll get some answers to those.
Sure. I had a quick question for Leonard about the well-being index, whether it would be calculated eventually for groups within society, like men and women, income quintile, by age, things like that.
Excellent. And Ian, did you want to ask your question to Khalid, and then we'll take those 2 as a pair and then open to more questions.
Sure. Yeah, just really interested to see this and just wondered, I saw that you had climate change and energy efficiency under consideration in your work. I was wondering if you'd thought about the sort of nature degradation, biodiversity side of things, and whether that was something you might take into account in the future with sort of COP15, etc., global biodiversity framework. Thanks.
Excellent. Leonard, did you want to go first?
Yeah, I think at least in principle, these indices are based around individuals or households, and so they can be divided up. They're different aspects of it are better for households than individuals, perhaps, but and there's certainly a lot of interest in the idea of following a cohort and understanding kind of the age profile of well-being within a country and how that might differ from country to country is very interesting and has been to some extent explored. Generally speaking, within the context of GDP, we're thinking more about following, a cross-section. But it's an excellent comment.
Excellent. Khalid, question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. This is a very, very spot on question. Actually, biodiversity is one of the indicators we considered, but there are difficulties in terms of adjusting for initial conditions. Saudi Arabia doesn't have the kind of biodiversity that Canada does, for reasons that are quite obvious. And so you could adjust for things like water scarcity and the impact of, climate change. And this is what we're considering right now. For example, the number of extreme weather events, or things like fatalities as a result of droughts and other things. So this is one of the things that we're considering. But in this particular formulation, we're interested in policy relevant action. So energy efficiency is something that the government can act upon, and that's also one of the criteria that we adopted. But it is a very good point, and it is one that we're considering in the new formulation. And you know that these indices are also organic beings in a way. They tend to change over time as we try to improve them with new data sets.
Excellent. Rutger, did you want to come in with your question?
Well, yeah, maybe also Leonard can see it in the chats. I don't know whether, I don't remember whether we discussed this in London, but I do think the work by Kahneman and Kruger on the U index might be of interest to your work. One of the things that they did do there, you probably also know it, but they actually also raised this issue that, these happiness scores of 1 to 5, for example, are a little bit difficult to aggregate, and they seem also to vary over cultures. So they actually concluded that a better way would actually to look at thresholds, because there is a lot more cultural convergence around, what are activities that are, unpleasant, so to speak, and pleasant. And so they actually look at that from the perspective of a threshold of, effect, so to speak. So I was just wondering whether Leonard had also included that type of work.
I mean,
and has that? Yeah.
Go on.
Sure. Well, and maybe any thoughts on that? I'd be very curious.
And I'll probably steal sort of chair's privilege for a second to sort of extend on that to both Khaled and Leonard, thinking about what Khaled you just said about extreme events. So thinking in the time context, one can imagine someone having a very good day, going to the theme park, having a really pleasant day, coming home and discovering that a member of the family had been in a tragic car accident and had died. And one would easily feel that that extreme event would significantly colour, if not completely reshape, their perspective of well-being over the day. So just a question for both of you about within your systems, how you're thinking about extreme events and managing that within your methods. Leonard, did you want to go first?
Okay. The UN index work is very interesting, and and we have a lot of difficulty fundamentally thinking about what we mean by well-being, and what question do we ask to elicit well-being. One hope that I have is that if we try to integrate these studies a bit more with time use in the way that we propose, is that might be able to bring some statistical evidence to bear that allows you to correct for, say, national biases. The U index work is very interesting, but what you wind up with is then you aggregate these values, and you wind up, and that gives you an intermediate sort of thing. I've thought a fair amount, Richard, about this question of how things change over time. And there's a wonderful anecdote about someone who's dying of cancer and is treated with LSD and psychotherapy, and his life is suddenly much better. And he looks at his whole life from a much different, more spiritual perspective. And he says, this period of time is the best time of my life. And I think that what you raise is a very difficult question for well-being and for GDP, but there are many difficulties with simply summing up well-being, and I think you've highlighted a very important one.
Thank you. Carlos, would you like to have the last word in this section?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It's a very tough question, but two insights might be useful. One is it's very difficult to measure happiness, I think, but one useful exercise, which I don't know has been tried or not, is to measure unhappiness. Okay, and use that as an entry point. It might be easier to do so. And you might find some surprising results there when you correlate with the income. How you measure unhappiness is, of course, another issue, but you can look at things like, social cohesion, crime rates, use of antidepressants, whatever. But I'm not sure anybody has, to my knowledge, has done a lot of work in terms of that correlation and the findings. So that might be an entry point. The other issue about the extreme events, we have a paper on conflict. Okay, so one of the things we wanted to do is to address Leonard's comparability problem. So we just stuck with things like battle-related deaths, IDPs and displaced populations, things that we can measure. And we came up with a categorical variable that we then used for telling stories about what happened over time. But I'm not sure how this can then, I mean, when you have that more objective measure and then you correlate it with other things like income, for example, you find some predictable results. But to get to the bottom of this issue of happiness, I think, or unhappiness, you would really need to have a lot more innovative approaches, such as the ones that Leonard has been talking about. So that's my 2 cents on this.
Well, thank you very much. And we are just about we're just about perfectly on time on the agenda, which is when you're chairing these things is always a minor miracle to achieve. So I've been delighted by that, but excellent conversation. And I think we've touched on some really, really interesting questions there. So let's keep going. And we're on to our third presenter now, Amit Kapoor from the Institute of Competitiveness in India, who's going to talk to us about the Social Progress Index. So Amit, can you share your slides? There they are. They're coming, I see.
Yes, just give me 3 seconds to really set it up.
No worries. I can see them and they're in full screen mode. You're good to go. I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
Perfect. Thank you. And I have 15 minutes, right?
Yeah, indeed you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me here to share views on the Social Progress Index that we have been able to develop in India. And I must share that this body of work was done with the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister. So I'm going to share a few set of ideas into how this was really built up. So, the whole debate that we were always grappling with the kind of changes that were happening in the world and what was actually happening within India as well, is in terms of like how democracies were changing and what was the kind of driver that was changing these democracies per se. So was it inequality? Was it that there were not enough opportunities and so on and so forth? If you really look at the whole set of the world, what we were also seeing is the diminishing of democratic values across the world, and what was really driving all this, the rise of the authoritarian leaders, etc. In fact, if you really look at the United States, there is something very interesting that happened. In fact, the previous election, the presidential election, and we were just trying to understand the statistics there. What we did find is that the Donald Trump voters were effectively coming from economically backward regions. Out of the 3,300 counties that were there, 600 counties which did well were Democratic in nature, and the rest of the 2,700 effectively were very biased towards the Republican system. And that is where we started looking at what was happening. And if you really look at it, it was very clearly seen that when you talk about places like, say, 2,700 districts, they were not having a huge level of economic activity. And there was also something very startling, and that was the quality of life in these locations was not absolutely up to mark. And this is where I think the idea was that you have to really understand a country per se, and you see that there are two set of objectives that we have to fundamentally understand. And what are those two set of objectives? And the two set of objectives were like, one is, of course, economic objectives that we have to achieve, that we really talk about GDP. You become the 5th largest economy in the world or whatever, but then again, that is itself is not a very great number to look at, because you have to look at GDP per capita, and that is what is happening. And this is where you have to look beyond measures which are beyond GDP, because GDP is masking or hiding a lot of issues. It masks the quality of life. It masks as to what are the kind of opportunities that are available to people and things. And this is where we started dabbling into this whole idea of various sets of things. And this is where Social Progress Index came into being. And this was also driven by what I call something very interesting, and that was we were also seeing the rise of poverty across the world, or when you talk about, say, homelessness, that was there. And then, of course, that exists across the world and which is rising. And there is also this factor that we were saying in developing countries that when you talk about homelessness or how cities were reacting or how states were reacting, and there was a huge problem that actually got exposed through COVID as well, because the negatives that we were seeing at the times of COVID, especially in terms of like how things were happening from vaccination point of view to availability of healthcare, it becomes fairly imperative that we have to look at measures which are beyond. There was another thing that we were seeing during COVID was the learning losses that actually existed. And the numbers were very, very, what do you call, alarming. The numbers were like the kind of learning losses that we were seeing would have taken close to about 5 to 6 years to recover. So if that is the kind of learning loss, that means you're talking about a situation wherein there could be a generation which would actually be left behind in terms of the possible learning that they could have actually done. So and how do we recover those set of things? How do we really create infrastructure? How do we really create processes that you're able to recover? And there was also a very clear evidence that was there that for every additional year of schooling that you were doing beyond class 8, it would actually add close to about 8,000 rupees. And I'm talking about Indian context here. For every additional year beyond class 8 will add about 8,000 rupees to your income every year. So that means if you're able to have better quality of learning, or if your foundational learning is better, and if you're studying beyond class 8, you are actually going to add to the value over a period of time. So, but then schooling is not about economic activity. It was something very social per se that you have to look at. And the question here was, what are the kind of right metrics that are that need to be seen? And this is where I just really wanted to share something very interesting. And these were numbers that were coming through. What we did see is that within the Indian context, that we have close to about 769 districts. And out of these 769 districts, there were close to about 100 districts which contribute close to about 85% of India's GDP. So that means there is this whole huge disparity that exists across the board. 100 districts answering for what you call 85% of GDP, 84% of exports that were happening. So there is that whole economically dark area as well, if you might want to say. But now you cannot leave those people behind, because there is also this very clear evidence that was there that wherever economically you're progressing, You would also have social indicators which are going to be better, either because of education or the services are better in those locations. And in this data, you would also see that the urban areas were effectively doing better. So how do you really catch up? What is the kind of process that you really need to do on a catch up? And this was, again, some set of data in terms of concentration of value generation across districts. And this was, again, something very important to see, that if you really look at the top 132 districts, they were accounting for about 50% of the national payroll that was happening, or the top 160 districts were also talking about 50% of national employment. So that means there is also this disparity in terms of employment that actually has a huge impact on the income levels and things. So how do we really look at the ambition for the future? And the ambition for the future was very clearly that, okay, now there are 4S framework that the government was talking about. And this is part of the work that I've done with Michael Porter in terms of writing the competitiveness roadmap for the country, wherein we said, okay, now there are 4 big things that you have to look at. One is, of course, shared prosperity. You have to talk about sustainability. You have to talk about resilience. That is what we are calling as solid. And you have to understand social progress as well. And if you really want to do this, what are the kind of measures that we have to look at to look into things, or look at the kind of situation that the country actually is in? We have the data for GDP across the districts. We have the data, what you call on poverty or disparity or whatever, but we do not have a composite index that is able to actually tell us as to what is the quality of life of people. There were many things that were happening. So you have this multidimensional poverty index, which is an important index that comes in, but it does not really give me a huge understanding of what the future is actually going to be about. So can we really develop something better than that? So if you really look at the priority action areas across the board, so there were a couple of things that became very, very clear, that how do we really understand childhood poverty? What is it that we are able to do to reduce childhood poverty? Can we invest in value-based healthcare, or how do we really look at the education system, enhancing public safety, and so on and so forth? And this is where there is this very important set of things that we really said. Okay, now if you really talk about the social progress index, the question that we have to ask for our societies, this is absolutely applicable across the world. Again, this is broadly the level of work that has been derived from Amartya Sen's work or Joe Stiglitz's work, and so on and so forth. But the question was that there were 3 fundamental pillars that we have to look at. And those 3 pillars, one was, of course, basic human needs. And this is where we have to look at, say, how are we providing for, or a district is providing for essential needs that are there. So water, sanitation. And this is where you would also see that in the Indian context, you saw a huge impetus on sanitation program. And this was getting driven from some of this understanding out here. This is some body of work that started in 2016, was presented for the first time in 2017, and now, of course, we have done it after an iteration of after a period of 5 years as well. And the second thing that was being looked at was foundations of well-being. Are building blocks available to enhance and sustain quality of life or well-being? And are there enough and adequate opportunities that are available? And this is where it became very important to understand things like, say, personal freedom and choice, and inclusiveness. Yes. So this is what was being looked at. And what we really said is, what are the kind of indicators that can be seen? So we looked at 49 indicators at the district level. And out of these, I can share the slides, but these 49 indicators were giving us a very clear understanding of what was happening within those districts itself. So this is the list of indicators that are there and how we were really looking at the data per se. But what was the most important thing that we found here was that each of the locations, we were able to create a scorecard for each of the districts, and we were able to suggest to the local authorities as well. So since it was being done from the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, there was a direct involvement there. This was presented to all the district administrators, and they could see the scorecard as to what are the areas where intervention is required on an immediate basis. How do you stack up against your peers as well? So if you were able to look at the scorecard, you were very able to see as to what is your dimension score, what is the area of intervention that is required, and there are things which require immediate attention. And there are some areas which could actually be seen as green or positive at that point in time, but you need to move forward. And this is how the whole social progress index across the districts looked like. It is not that India was all perfect. there were challenges, and you can actually see within this data itself that there are, and you also see that economically better locations have better social progress within this context. And this is where we also looked at the financial inclusion per se, and this is where as you know, like in the Indian context, we've had this whole digital payment infrastructure that has got created, the whole banking system that has really got developed on top of it. We did see that there was this huge push towards the financial inclusion. So what you were seeing is that there were these positive steps that were being taken using this index. And we also tried to look at the aspirational district program, which is again a program which was done at 112 districts, which were the backward most 112 districts within the country. And what did we find is that we started seeing these districts starting to perform better on the social progress index. So what we have seen is that there were specific programs where interventions were done. And now these districts have actually come within the top 50% of the country. And there are other districts who have to actually follow in terms of really saying that we need to make ourselves better. We also looked at this relationship between social progress and multidimensional poverty. And what we did find is that as you really improve the social progress scores, we see that multidimensional poverty reduction is also there. So we started looking at some very important indicators here and ideas in terms of really getting it out. But there was something very important in terms of from a methodological point of view. There is this whole huge criticism in terms of saying as to what are the right set of indicators that have to be looked at. I'm not saying that this is the perfect metric, but it does give us a very good idea. And of course, it's a process wherein we are trying to even evolve over a period of time to saying as to what are the better indicators that we are able to look at. It is not something which is etched in stone, but we also looked at, say, something like, say, alpha and the KMF values to understand as to how the data was working. But very quickly, I'll not take more than 2 more minutes. We also looked at this data. Again, when you talk about social progress, it was very important that we just don't look at one way of looking at the complete set of population, because you have to look at, or you have to slice and dice it at various age levels, and you have to understand it for different sets of demographics. And this is where we looked at the index on quality of life for elderly. Again, with the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister, when we said, okay, now can we really understand as to what's happening at the elderly level? And this is where we said, okay, financial well-being, social well-being, health system, income security becomes important for them. And what is really happening? What are the kind of action that we need to take? What policy action should be taken to really make lives better for the elderly? And they were also stacked up to SDGs. And what we are seeing is, in fact, the way India has been able to achieve SDGs, the pace of achievement of SDGs is fairly slow in the world, but India will be in a position to achieve it by 2070. The world will achieve it in 2199 at the rate at which this is happening. But this is where we also found this whole huge, disparity that exists across the various set of states and how action needs to be taken. And this we actually extended to other idea like, say, foundational learning, because learning losses was a very important issue that was happening. So can we extend it to a place like, say, foundational learning? Can we understand what is the state of foundational learning within the country? And this is where that index was also created to understand, because this whole idea of competitive federalism that is being driven within the country. It makes a very good thing in terms of understanding for states to see as to where they're lagging behind their peers or other states or other districts, and what kind of actions can be taken. And this is where, again, we found that there are, of course, those variations across the state, but surprising results. Some states which were expected to do very well have not done exceedingly well. There are some places which are lagging behind, and so on and so forth. But this can actually have a huge bearing, because this has a huge bearing on the competitiveness of the nation over a long period of time. So this was also seen in perspective. So this is where the index was, and this is how we have really looked at the various sets of indices across the board and tried to find answers to. But now again, we are looking at the next iteration, which should be out within the next 6 months, and we are seeing or expecting much more action in terms of efforts to really push it forward. I think the debate here was to really have an index which is able to function, rather than actually just sitting down and discussing as to what are the right metrics or whatever. Let's move forward. Let's improve it over a period of time. Let best not be the enemy of good, and really move forward in terms of a positive direction. Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, and perfectly to time. Exactly right. Thank you. So we've got 3 speakers in this session, and then we will take a session for questions and answers. So do please keep dropping your questions into the sidebar as we move forward. Our next speaker is Cleanna Taylor, who is from the UK ONS also, and I'm going to declare an interest. Cleanna and I have worked together on this topic for a long time, so it's a delight to see inclusive income in the UK. Cleanna, over to you. I will give you a 5-minute warning, but you got 15 minutes. Thank you. I can see the slides. All good.
Perfect. Okie dokie. So thank you very much. I'm Cleanna Taylor from the UK ONS, and I'm going to be talking to you about our work on inclusive income. So just to give a preview of what I'll talk about, we'll start by talking about the purpose of this work. We'll talk about some of the building blocks of things that it uses and that it builds upon. And then we'll start talking about its definitions and how it really shifts boundaries and builds upon those. Then finally, we'll turn to some of the results. We'll show some of those and some of the stories that we can draw upon it. And then finally, I'll talk about the ways in which we've been engaging users, as in some of these sprints, that's really come out as one of the important areas for us. So first off, let's talk about purpose. And I love what was mentioned earlier about the use of these data tools for different users. We all have different tools for different needs. And I think a lot of what's come out of this has been the fact that we need to understand what the best tools are for different purposes, as well as understanding what the sort of toolboxes that we want to put together are. You know, I think about the difference between a Swiss Army knife, which gives you just the essentials that you need in a pinch. You've got that beginner's toolbox. That's the one that I have in my wardrobe that I try and not delve into. And then my brother, who works as a mechanic, he has an incredibly impressive set in the garage. Thinking about what we want in each of them is really important and depends on the user. So talking first about the users that we have here. So for us in the UK, there are a group of users for whom the economic accounting underlying GDP, and importantly, the national accounts, is a core feature of why they're using GDP at the moment. And it's something that they would very much like to maintain in any beyond GDP metric. That might be the single one they want to use, or it might be one that they want to put into their toolbox. So inclusive income is a metric that sits alongside a comparable one called inclusive wealth that builds upon the national accounts and other international economic accounting standards. And it's aimed at meeting 3 sort of core requirements. So one is that it eases the transition from GDP for some users. So we'll show how this takes place a little later on. Also, the resource requirements from an NSI are very minimal because it builds on existing resources. Actually, it only requires 1 or 2 extra people to really get a lot of extra value added. And then finally, having it build upon GDP and build upon those existing blocks, it actually increases the analytical use of inclusive income because it can be compared with other metrics. So with that mentioned, let's get on to actually what we're doing here. So let's get on to some of those building blocks of what we utilize. So the first and perhaps the most important is the national account. So the framework that GDP comes from. It's also very important to say that the national accounts include a lot other than GDP, and that's partially what gives them their power. You know, you can look at GDP, but then you can ask, was GDP growth in the form of wages? Was it in the form of profits, mixed income? Was it consumer spending? Was it investment? That sort of accounting is really what makes it powerful for what it does. Of course, it doesn't do everything, though, as we've discussed in good detail. So we build upon that, utilising household satellite accounts. So these are the accounts that record the activity that take place in households that are unpaid. And there's guidance for this in the form of the UN ECE Guide on Valuing Unpaid Household Work. Then we add on top of this data from a human capital satellite account. It includes data on investment, depreciation, and stocks of human capital. And that comes in the form of the UN ECE Guide on Measuring Human Capital. And then finally, of the core building blocks, we have the environmental satellite account. which records the economic value of the natural world, including natural capitals. And that comes in the form of a system of economic environmental accounting. So all of these are broadly conceptually similar. There are differences between them, slight tweaks, which is what this work does. It brings them together, tries to make them add that little extra consistency to get the true value, or that extra added value, I should say. They all have value in and of themselves as well. So what does this do exactly? So when thinking about, for those people who are interested in the economic accounting and wish to build upon beyond GDP, but still work in the economic accounting space, we can think of at least one of the dimensions that we might want to shift, being how narrow or how broad our concept of what the economy is. And it's important to point out that GDP already fits somewhere in the middle on that dimension. You might think on a far end is something like just purely thinking about the market sector. You could even go even narrower and just focus on manufacturing, or some areas where we know that our methods and our data are the strongest. But you could think of something like the market sector, and that meets a lot of the conceptual needs of things that feed into GDP about having market prices and things like that. But then GDP itself already goes and it adds in the public sector, or it adds in the non-market sector, so your charities and whatnot. So GDP already builds upon that a little bit. And what we're looking is to push that further while still maintaining that economic accounting framework. So that's where gross inclusive income comes in. So that expands the production boundary. We'll talk a bit about what that means in the next slide. But it still maintains that gross aspect, the gross being that it doesn't include the depreciation of capitals. So you can build upon that a little further, include the depreciation of capitals. We'll talk about that, and you get to your net inclusive income. And then finally, conceptually, you could build upon that further with some of the adjustments that we've heard over the past year or two about, for example, accounting for income distribution. Martin Wheel in the past has talked about democratic versus plutocratic measures of growth. But then it is important to mention that for even people who want to focus on an economic understanding, for those purposes, you may still want to eventually move to a pluralistic indicator framework, even if you are just focusing on the economic side. So what does this look like for our economic accounts? So two of the important boundaries for national accounts are the production boundary and the asset boundary. The production boundary, simplifying heavily in my head, is I think of it as how we really define what is economic activity. And the asset boundary is, at least for capitals, for produced assets, those are the factors of production, of what goes into production. So if we think about how they're drawn at the moment in the system of national accounts, we've got these two boxes here. And then I'm going to draw in the ways in which we're going in and changing these production boundaries. So there are some changes that we're making within the production boundary where we're reclassifying how we treat things. So human capital, for example, wages are already included within the system of national accounts, but they're not conceptualized as a return to a capital, so you can reconceptualize it. But then there's also other areas, for example, unpaid household services that currently lie outside the production boundary, and we're going to expand the boundary to include them. Ecosystem services straddle the boundary. There are some that are included at the moment. So for example, those aspects of nature for which there is a market, so logging, for example, that's included within the production boundary, but there are other ecosystem services within the SIA that are currently outside. And we make equivalent changes to the asset boundary alongside that. So just talking about the work that we've done so far, one of the things that I want to point out, and I'll get back to this when we talk about our method for engaging users, this is still a work in progress. So I've added sort of another red boundary around this that highlights what we've been able to do so far. So we've made some of the tweaks within the S&A production boundary. So we've added in some expanded intangible asset investment. We've also included some extra ecosystem services that were not previously included, and we've included unpaid household services. But one of the key areas that we're still doing some research, which we hope to publish by the end of this year, is around human capital investment that we haven't been able to include, at least in our numbers yet. So we've made corresponding changes around the asset boundary to include those extra natural capitals and including household capitals in those expanded intangible assets. So let's get to what those numbers look like. So what I've got here is, I believe they sometimes called waterfall diagrams. So in the grey bars, I've got some of the measures, 5 minutes, that correspond to those measures that we talked about earlier as you expanded your definition of the economy. And then in the green bars, I've got those aspects that add between those measures of things that we're adding in. So between market GVA and GDP, we add in non-market and we add in taxes and subsidies. And then to get from GDP to gross inclusive income, we had a couple of components. But one of the key messages, for example, that jumps out of this, if you look at household production, that largest green bar, it's comparable in size to market GVA. So you can immediately see from these data the important role that the work that goes on unpaid within the household takes. In the interest of time, I also want to mention this focused on just 1 year, 2019, but similar to GDP, we can also produce volume figures. So we can see GDP, for example, in the light orange line since 2005. And you can compare that with the dark red line that's gross inclusive income. They follow similar trends, but you can see that, for example, there's less variation over time. There's a shallower recession in 2009, but also a shallower recovery. So we can get at the fact that once you include some of these particularly extra non-market activities, the sort of volatility in the market cycle that we see is less pronounced. And then I'll cover through these quickly, but you can take those changes and you can decompose them to see what's driving growth over time. So household services, as well as being a large part of the economy, also drove a lot of gross inclusive income growth. That's a source of growth that we don't capture in GDP at the moment, and draw attention to. And you can do something similar for net inclusive income and have a look how those capital depreciations are contributing. And you can see, for example, the importance of depreciation in household capital. So those are your washing machines and your cars and things like that. So finally, to come on, an important point is how we've been engaging users in this work. So 3 things to mention. We've taken an approach of publishing this work as the work is progressing. So although it's a work in progress, we have already published these numbers, published the methodologies behind them, and we have an aim to update that work every 6 months, both to add additional periods to the data, but also gradually improve the methodologies. And this means it gives users the chance both to feed back to us actively about those methodologies, about those data, so we can incorporate that into future work. But there's a lot of users who might be focused on just one area. So if we have users who are really focused on unpaid household services, they can already use this data for a lot of their purposes. But in addition to that, we're publishing blogs alongside a lot of this work that really helps explain to people who might be more unfamiliar in more common terms, in a lighter-hearted way, exactly what the use of these data are and the stories that are coming out with them. And we're also engaging in workshops that are going on, covering the broad suite of Beyond GDP work that ONS is doing. An example of one of those that's coming up soon, that's being jointly organised with the Royal Statistical Society, is happening next Tuesday, but there's also one, for example, on a Thursday about what Beyond GDP means for the UK. So several different approaches to try and capture the several different users that we have. Thank you very much.
Excellent. And again, within the time, wonderful stuff. So let's move on directly to our third speaker in this session, William Mohava from UNECA, who's going to talk to us about the multidimensional measurement of poverty in Africa. So William, would you like to share your slides? Fabulous. I can see those looking perfect. I'll give you a 5-minute warning in 10 minutes. Oh, William, you're on mute.
How did it go back to mute again? Okay, thank you so much. I'll present the work which we did as part of the development account. And this work, we did it from 2021 to 2022. This work has actually resulted in a publication. Those who are interested will actually be able to provide you. It's from our ECA publication office. It's called The Multiple Dimensions of Poverty in Africa. So what I'm just going to present today is the journey we walked through, which is relevant for the issues under discussion here. So I'll look at how we looked at the data which we could use for the MPI, the advantages of the data available in African countries, the disadvantages, the use of the money metric poverty, measurements, the challenges we actually faced in this. Firstly, let me just say this project came out as a result of questions which were being raised during the COVID era, that is COVID going to increase poverty levels in Africa? And when we looked at the methods available, one of the methods which we thought we could apply was the MPI, but unfortunately, as you realize, most of the data which is available to measure the MPI tends to be a bit out of date. So we couldn't actually access current data on that. So in Africa, most of the MPI data sources are from household surveys, especially the living standards measurement surveys. There are countries which do that. Multiple indicator cluster surveys, the mix, household income and expenditure, multi-topic household surveys. I should also add there the DHS, demographic and health surveys. Then there are countries which have started using censuses to calculate the MPI. And I'll briefly go into each one of these. But before I look at what are the design issues in the tools which are used to collect this information. Most of these surveys are designed to collect data to be used for the calculation of money metric poverty. And that is a disadvantage in Africa because apparently money metric measurement doesn't measure all the aspects of actually poverty. As you know, the employment levels are quite low. Most of the indicators are actually addressed beforehand. So when you want now to use them for the MPI, a lot of conversion has to be done to actually make sure the variables are complying to what we want. The money metric surveys have evolved since the 1970s and became more popular in the 1980s. And it enables national poverty calculations and World Bank purchasing power parity. So that's why some of these surveys have remained static, because they are answering to a certain requirement. So in terms of multi-dimensional poverty measurement in Africa using microdata, the main sources are the censuses, administrative data, household surveys and metadata. So let's look at each one of those and just see what we sort of found out in trying to apply these. The census is the first, which is the largest anyway. The advantages of it being it can increase the confidence intervals. Conducting a census often results in enough respondents to have a high degree of statistical confidence. And data for subpopulations can be done. For example, you can calculate MPI for rural, urban regions, and so forth. But the main disadvantages are that they have low frequency once every 10 years. So, you know, like now we are in the 2020 round. Some countries haven't. So if we wanted to include those countries, you'll be referring to data like for 2014. And macro data might not be available to researchers. This is a big problem in terms of actually accessing data in Africa, where you actually have to apply to national statistical offices. Then we have administrative data, which is actually either civil registration data from ministries of finance, banks, and so forth. This makes it possible to analyze at local, state, and national levels, contained very detailed, accurate information, large and covers samples of individuals and time periods. For example, data from banks cover individuals who would not normally respond to survey. Very, very critical. But administrative data also has its own disadvantages, as we found out. The information collected in administrative records is limited and may not match the research purpose. For example, from civil registration or from identity management, you might not be able to get much, or to link it to, let's say, economic, activities of the individuals. Any changes in data collection procedures or definitions may prevent comparability over time. So if there's any change, then you cannot compare with past trends. Metadata is usually not available, and access of administrative data varies by countries. Then let's go to household surveys, which are the major sources. And in this case, we talk about the MICS, the DHS. They are reasonably accurate because of the intensity which is actually applied in collecting this information. It is cheap to collect because it's based on samples. Unfortunately, household surveys typically exclude certain groups. For example, in our situations, nomadic people, illegal migrants, refugees, homeless, and so forth, and even those institutionalized. So we actually lose the ones who are even more susceptible to poverty. Household surveys may also overlook the elderly within households. As we know, most of these are confined to certain ages. Some excluded groups may be particularly marginalized, as I explained. So what are the issues with data, especially in Africa? The issue of timing. Frequency, poverty data continues to lag behind most other economic information. The lack of frequent data makes it impossible to inform policies. For example, as I said from the beginning, we wanted to measure the impact of COVID-19 on poverty levels, but the data which we could find was 3-4 years back. So trying to align it with poverty, COVID-19, it was almost impossible. What we ended up doing was identify groups which might be vulnerable to COVID because of their poverty situations. The nature of the indicators that are collected in another area face issues of potential improvement. For example, the variables are not collected in the way we would want to use them in calculating the MPI. Then the issue of complementarity between the different sources like censuses, administrative data, surveys, and so forth. So what are the issues in terms of indicator design? What I would just mention there is, how do we identify who is poor and who is non-poor? And in our cases, that becomes very difficult to sort of demarcate where you can say poverty levels fall in there. And And I think my colleague, I mean, one of the colleagues actually mentioned that part, how we determine the categories and how we, segment. Okay.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, thank you. Becomes quite an issue. So one of the things which we did, we looked at the current MPI, and we decided that it was actually not very representative of what we wanted. Usually the global MPI has 3 dimensions. It has health, it has education, and standard of living. So what we did for the African MPI, we added in the issue of economic activity, and we defined it as unemployment. So it's one of those things which we actually, added as an adaptation of the global MPI, that last dimension with an indicator called unemployment. Then we defined it if all adults aged 15 to 64 in the household are unemployed. Then we also had to weight it as the other 3 indicators. So now the weights had to be 25 to 25% for each category. So just a general sort of comparison of what we did, the African MPI, we ended with 4 dimensions versus the global one, which has 3 dimensions, and we had 11 indicators versus the global one with 10 indicators. The cutoff point was now 26%, yet the global one, the cutoff point is 33%. Basically, we used the DHS. In the global one, they use both the DHS and mix. So the issues of data challenges remain to measure the MPI in Africa. Ideally, we are supposed to calculate using the same variables for comparison. For example, if we can give, the issue of nutrition, the way it is measured across countries differs a lot. Nutritional status at times is measured for under 5, at times is measured for women in the reproductive ages, and at times, if men are included, it's 15 to 90. So this varies so much. We just gave nutrition there as an example. So to conclude, African countries have a lot of data collected for the money metric poverty calculation over the years. However, this does not take into account non-monetary issues. Then there's need to make the DHS and mix surveys collect more data and add employment, both formal and informal employment variables to data collected so that it can be used to calculate economic activities by the member states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there we complete our trilogy of 3 perfectly timed presentations. So I'm going to open now for questions from the floor. If you want to either raise your hand or put your question in the sidebar, that would be fantastic. Just to give everyone a moment to think of questions. A question I think for all 3 presenters from me around frequency of publication. I think all of you mentioned frequency of publication as a key issue in your talks. And I'd like your thoughts on how frequency matters in driving use, in getting users engaged with your metric. Amit, would you like to take this one first?
Absolutely. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So in terms of frequency, it has to be from my context and the way we were operating. It has to be something which has to be updated every year, because that is where you're able to push forward the developmental agenda. And I'm really talking from the perspective of how the government has actually been using the indices, because they find it to be a very important factor. Of course, there would be some data which is not available on a yearly basis. There could be a lag in that. But in spite of that, because there would be some leading indicators which are going to get updated fairly frequently. So you need to do that, because then you're able to push the local authorities in terms of saying that, okay, now this is what you need to act on, and how the impetus is there. And there is, and especially within the aspirational district program, what the government had actually done in India was that there was this, if you were doing better, there was a far better funding that was available, or there was a competitive funding bid that was actually available. So there was an impetus, or there was an incentive to really perform better and really work towards that direction as well, because then you're able to see that you're improving over a period of time.
Excellent. Kiana, did you want to come in on this one?
Yes, I think it's a very interesting question. And there are several factors that's been mentioned about data availability is almost one of the key points. But also one of the things from our work that has come out is one of the forces behind going beyond GDP is often to focus on some longer term trends that we see, and we see that in our data, for example, by the fact that our gross inclusive income figures tend to be less volatile over time. GDP, although it does include non-market aspects, does center and focus on the market to some extent, and therefore you have the volatility of the business cycle in there. So there's something to say for having a bit more of a focus on some of these longer term trends that might mean that the frequency of the data might be a little less. Two things to mention about that though. So one is the difference between the frequency and the timeliness of the data. So you could have annual data that are published with a long lag, or you could have annual data that are published on a very up-to-date basis. So making sure, even if it is less frequent, having a shorter lag, I think is something that is very key. But also we had the experience of COVID recently, where there was something that affected well-being, I think it's safe to say, that often had very quick turnarounds. So still having some sort of scope for fast-moving indicators for some key aspects that might be rougher around the edges, might not be as comprehensive, but still can aid policymakers for some of those quick turnarounds. I think those are some of the balances to strike.
Yes, no, I think we've all experienced that one. William, did you want to come in on this one, and then we'll bring in Wafa, who I think has a question for us. But William,
okay,
you first.
Yeah, I think just a quick one, because I mean we are in a continent which is faced by emergencies, and that really makes the frequency of this more needed than ever. I think Cleo actually indicated the issue of COVID. I mean, if we're using, let's say, administrative data, which is possibly real-time data, then we would have been able to link, or at least to measure the effect of COVID on, on poverty levels. So for me, I mean, this opportunity of including other data sources, especially administrative data, becomes very, very critical, because that's continuous data which we are collecting, I mean, in other spheres. How can we use that? And also, we need also to be very innovative. Now, how do we start using big data? Because that's one of the issues which I think we should look at, even for these composite measures, that we might not need to rely on the traditional sources which I mentioned during my presentation, but big data and other sources. Thank you.
No, very, very good points. I'm going to open the floor. I'm going to take a question from Wafa and then one from Hassan. So Wafa, would you like to come in first? I'm not sure if Wafa can come in. So her question is, I think for Cleanna, how human capital can account for capital from migrant students, researchers, skilled workers, and thinking about how it might affect countries of origin. So cross-border movements of human capital. Hassan, did you want to come in and ask your question?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this great session. The question that I have is related to the composite indicators like social progress in the index or development challenge index. You know, these indicators are made of different variables at different levels of clustering. So, and sometimes we need to weight each variable differently to get a single number at the end and compare. And if we look at even the correlation between these indicators with already existing indicators, we see that these indicators are highly correlated with those. So the beauty of these new indicators are being hidden when we add all the variables together and make a single indicator. So just my suggestion is that, is it possible to use a visualization like a radar chart that shows at different clusters and levels that shows what are the areas that are missing or what are the areas that needs more attention compared to others. And if you want to get a single number at the end, something like area under that radar can be used as a measure to compare, for example, different areas or different levels of the indicators. That was my suggestion. This is actually based on my experience of we had this indicator in our UNSDCF in Iran, and we were using for health, we were using about 19 indicators, and this was the problem, that how we can weight different indicators, that sometimes they have different even units and dimensions. That was my suggestion and question, and I wanted to know what do you think about this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a question for Cleanna on human capital and treatment of cross-border flows, and a question on nesting of data, decomposition of data within composites, so we can see the data underneath the headline number. So Cleanna, did you want to go first, and then we'll turn to Amit first and open to everybody on the second question.
Sure. So an incredibly interesting area, and one that I'm very excited for once we do have human capital investment and depreciation to have a look what they look like for the UK. But this for us is one of the reasons why it's very important. We're doing inclusive income at the same time as doing inclusive wealth. And the reason is, so if we think about for the UK, for example, we're a country that has quite a strong university sector and quite a strong international student sector. So there we have effectively investment in human capital, some of which comes to the UK, and then we have people who like the UK or decide to stay here and work long term. So we have investment in their education, and then we also have the returns of that in the UK. Or we have people who come and we have investment in human capital, and then we effectively have capital transfers between countries when human capital moves across. So understanding the extent to which the human capital stock in the UK derives from investment in the UK or investment in other countries is a really interesting issue, as well as the extent to which the UK invests in human capital and then has capital transfers of that with other countries. And it will be very exciting to be able to then break that down by the countries of origins and see exactly where that flows. But that relates capital stocks and what's going on with those to income flows, and they both would tell different stories. So, for example, on the flow side, you would see when investment happens, you'd see when people are taught, and you'd see depreciation. You would see when people in their jobs use that human capital, and those would contribute. Whereas on the capital side, you'd also be able to see when there are these shifts of capital appearing and disappearing. So the appearance of the capital, similar to when a mineral is discovered, it appears. that would appear in the stocks, or it would disappear, similar to when there's a natural disaster. So by focusing on both inclusive income and inclusive wealth, you'll be able to get that comprehensive picture of something like human capital, which, as you pointed out, you can draw out of it the actual sort of human stories of migration and international students and researchers that would help us understand things like yes, some big policy decisions, both in the UK and abroad.
Excellent. Amit, did you want to start on the decompositions question?
So there's something very important as a question that we are really looking at. The question here is that the moment I start decomposing and really start putting it into the index, it starts making things very, very complicated. The question is going to be, what are the number of indicators? What is the big set of things that I'm really looking at? Say a very simple thing like, say, if I really want to talk about measuring anemia, there could be many actions that need to be taken for doing it. So should I really only look at, say, outcome indicators or input indicators? So what we have done for the social progress is that we have just looked at the outcome indicators. We have not looked at the input or the output variables. So if the outcomes are right, that yes, we are achieving it. But then again, this is also backed up with something very important, that each of the districts within the country, what they're doing is they have the district development plan effectively. They're saying as to what they want to achieve over a period of time. And then it is getting broken down into further sets of things. So when you talk about, say, foundational literacy, and if the learning outcomes are bad, we know that there are issues that need to be looked at, but there are going to be many steps that need to be taken. So because foundational literacy would mean numeracy, language, and many other things that have to be acted upon. So the question here is that how many can we look at? So the idea was to really keep it at a minimalistic, which gives us a very big broad view. But there's an important suggestion in terms of those maps that we are really saying, or bar charts that you're really trying to do. That does give us a figure or a very important view in terms of like how far are we from the frontier. Because the question here is also that how quickly are we achieving the frontier? That is something that needs to get mapped. So we have done that work as well. I'll request everybody to look at the report and see that there are those things that have actually been looked at in terms of like how quickly are you achieving the frontier. The frontier was adjusted to SDGs. And if that SDG is something that you want to achieve, how quickly are you moving towards that? And things. And there are those blocks and comparisons that have been made between various sets of districts. They've also been broken down to various what I call peer groups and bases a certain population level and things. Over to you, Richard. And I hope I answered the question.
No, you got a thumbs up from Hassan. William, did you have any thoughts on this question? Oh, you're on mute, William.
Sorry, no matter how many times we use this, we normally forget. So this decomposition is very, very critical, because you want to answer the question for a policymaker and say, yeah, I know the group which is poor, but what causes them to be poor? So if we are able to decompose and be able to describe, in terms of, which are these population subgroups according to, variables which are significant, then at least that will have policy, relevance. The question which has been asked, actually, we have also been asked, you have successfully showed us who is poor. What do we do? And what are the interventions which are required? And it's a question which we are still battling with the team which worked on that, and say, surely from the way we did it, I don't think we can answer it with certainty. We need to do some further work. So I think, those who are sort of involved in MPIs, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, we will be willing to engage with them and further and say, how can we answer this decomposition issue? Thank you.
Thank you. Cleona, did you have any views on this one?
So I presented some of the data of how we can break down some of our measures into compositional charts and things like that can be rather useful. It is one of the areas of developing exactly what is most useful to users of how they visualize that exactly. Our data still working that economic accounting framework. So there's, you know, they aggregate and can be broken down, and there's comparisons, for example, between current price and constant price. So finding the mechanisms to best convey that accounting side of things to users is one of the key aspects. So that's why, for example, I showed the stacked bar chart we have, as it sort of highlights that there's a total that's hit and how the data break down. But it's something that we're constantly asking for feedback from users for, and drawing on some of the previous experience of national accounts and the sort of analysis that we've done for those to see how best those can be visualized.
Excellent. I'm going to open and give a final chance for any final questions. I'm just going to give you, I think we've got a raised hand. Hang on, let me just swap to the other view. Yang Chan, come on board.
Hi, good morning, Richard. Good morning, the panel. Very excellent presentations this morning. William, just to share, we are producing global MPI reports with OFI. As you may know, HDRO. I'm from Yanchun Zhang from HDRO UNDP. So we do have this decomposition exercise in our reports. So I will include the information in the chat box. Then in some editions of the reports, we publish this report every year. Then in our 2021 report, we look at disaggregated data for some ethnic groups. So very, very interesting. We cover a list of African countries. So I will also include my contact info. Yeah, look forward to further discussions. I will also check on your African MPI work. Very interested.
Excellent, thank you. So let me just go back to the chat and check there. I don't think we've got any more. So I'm going to give some summary reflections. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to take up probably my full 11 minutes. But I wanted to start by thanking all of our presenters today. That has been a really fantastic set of presentations on some of the key new developments and some of the key new thoughts which are happening in this space. Just reflecting on what we've seen today, one of the things I think is very clear to me is in this beyond GDP space, I think I see all of the presenters working to think sort of implicitly how they make their metric competitive and comparable and having the same qualities as GDP, because I think we all recognize if we're going to convert users to use different metrics, they have to be comparable in terms of frequency of publication and be able to decompose the drivers of growth so we understand what is happening at a more detailed level. We have the benefits of comparability, whether that's within a nation or internationally. I think that is something we've seen a lot of today. And a couple of really interesting areas which, from a methodology point of view, I think were very clear from a number of presenters, and we see sort of I see coming through as themes. The first was building indices via domains, having nested sets of data which were brought together within a domain before aggregation higher up, or presenting data which can be broken down and being explained via those domains. I think that's a vitally important aspect of this, and actually methodologically thinking about, as I was talking about at the start, whether we build composites in one go or with a two-step approach actually is an interesting question if we find that we need to look at these in slightly different ways. William touched on a really important point, I think, right at the end about imputation of missing values, or particularly where countries are collecting data on slightly different definitions, and the need to think particularly about this when we're using administrative data or unusual data sources. I think this is one where, very much going back to those first principles, there is this, I think this is one we need to keep front and center in our mind as a rising challenge, that new data sources present great opportunities, but they might present us some challenges in this space. And I think when we're thinking about how we do this without increasing burdens on national statistics institutes, the reusability of data, the application of that data across more than its original purpose is necessarily going to be one of the key drivers of being able to make these metrics producible in large scale, which obviously is absolutely required if we're talking about international comparability. I'm going to finish touching on one point, and then I'm just going to open to any of the presenters in case they would like to make any final contributions. But it also strikes me that when we talk about GDP, we talk about a very here and now view of the world. And across a number of the talks today, I saw people very much bringing a forward-looking perspective or data which relates to the future. Khalid talked about environmental sustainability. Cleanna talked around longer-term trends. Amit talked about opportunity, all of which are facets of how people see, perceive, and interact with the future. And I think that is an angle that it's increasingly clear that as a community, when we're taking the opportunity of these composite indices, that we're looking for how we can exploit that dimension in a way that GDP inherently doesn't do. But those were initial thoughts and reflections from me. I see some of you have come back on screen, but I'll open to any of the speakers who would like to make a final contribution. Khalid, would you like to come in first?
Yeah, just a final reflection on this issue of the future. It is vitally important that we know why we're developing these indices and composite indices. And if it's for policy guidance, then the policymakers are going to ask, well, so what? You know, and what happens if I introduce this shock or that? Or what's the business as usual scenario? And what happens, you know, if we target this particular fiscal policy intervention or whatever. Now, the agility of the index and its ability to respond to these questions is, of course, another criteria. Because we don't, I mean, in the UN, as you know, we don't do this. I mean, it's lovely academic work, but our center of gravity is, in fact, whether or not these indices are able to respond to the demands of policymakers. So it's a vitally important criteria. And in fact, some of the indicators were dropped precisely because they're stock variables that are very difficult to influence by policy interventions. So my final reflection is that yes, absolutely, this is the key, that it has to be built in the design of the index, whether or not you're able to forecast and respond to country demands for policy interventions. Thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you very, very much. Leonard.
Yeah, this is just a little thought, but when we think about well-being in a hedonic fashion, health becomes extraordinarily important. And, you know, the interesting difficulty that we have is health is very important, and it's also very expensive. And so that's one of the interesting conundrums that to me underlie integrating GDP and health and well-being. And in particular, in the United States is a particular problem because we have this private health system, but people have trouble paying for medicine, and in national public health systems, people have trouble accessing medicine, and those are have very important consequences for well-being.
really important point. If I'd given myself more time in the introduction, I mentioned the UK Treasury's estimate of the value of a well-being year at £13,000, but the value they equally put on a quality-adjusted life year, sort of a year lived in full health, is £70,000. And that material difference, I think, is very important, because from the quality-adjusted life year, we do derive another variable, which is the statistical life year, sort of the value of the average health life in the UK, so the average level of health, which comes in about £60,000. If one could close half the difference between the average and that quality adjusted, that full health example of 70, it's more than a third of the well-being number. It's a very vitally important driver, and that probably takes us right back to that conversation about thinking about how we consider these trade-offs. It's almost the killer example, isn't it? I see Kiana has her hand up. Kiana.
No, really useful final comments. I thought I'd chime in on, from hearing this and from previous presentations, some of the thoughts that came to mind. And one in particular is, we talked about different tools, and I sometimes think of the example of a nuclear power plant. As somebody who doesn't know much about nuclear physics, maybe the metrics that I want to know might be how much power is the power plant outputting? And maybe what are the radiation levels outside of it? Something basic that just lets me know it's functioning right, how's it doing? But then there's also the people inside the power plant who must have metrics on the temperatures. They must have metrics on the depletion of fuel. They must have metrics on the water that's moving through it. And within that, they understand how these different things interlink, so that they can pull the particular levers, push the particular buttons that they need to pull to make the power plant function properly. And I see a lot of what we end up doing with the composite indices is less about actually producing that one final number, and more about understanding the interlinkages, understanding the physics that go on between them. That may mean coming to one single number, or it may mean coming to showing users, what are the physics that underlie these, even if there's going to be several of them.
Agreed. I think there's value that we can extract at all levels. Amit, do you want to come on in?
Yes, just very quickly, like effective from a policymaker's perspective, I think what becomes important is the level of geography at which we are able to measure. Now, the smaller the level of geography, the more important it becomes and more easily it becomes to be acted on. So if you're really talking about a country, we do those indices, but the question is that can we take it to the ward level, the smallest level at which the data is available, or a zip code level? Then you're able to act upon. In fact, if you want to do something at a city level, then breaking down the city into various sets of areas or whatever, it would start helping, because there is that inner city problem and so on and so forth. So the level of geography is exceedingly important for doing this work. We should just not stop at a certain level. Take it to the smallest level as possible. Over to you, please.
Thank you all very, very much. Well, I'm delighted to say that we've been joined today by up to about 90 colleagues from around the world. I hope we've had the opportunity to present to you a diverse range of work and information in this field. The slides will be made available via the website, which is mentioned right at the top of the chat. A number of the authors today have put their contact details onto their slides, and as Leonard and others have invited people to come back with comments, please do, because I think this is very much an open set of questions that we are grappling with here. There's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of opportunities actually. So if you have a bright idea, don't keep it to yourself. Please do share, and we look forward to hearing from you. Our next and final sprint in the series of sprints is going to be held on the 5th of October. So you have a week off before we return for the final set of sprints. And that is going to be a reflection across the totality of the things that we've been able to talk about in this series of sprints. So environmental ESG data from the private sector, distributional approaches, dashboard approaches, composite approaches, and some of the work happening in other parts of the UN ecosystem. So please do, if you're able to join us again, same time on the 5th of October. And if you need access to that, please do contact the NES email address, and we'll be delighted to add you to the list. Thank you very much. I hope you have a very pleasant rest of your day and look forward to seeing many of you at the 5th October event. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.